Hello, I present to you a fan fiction set in the world of the game Gothic. Chapter 6. Secrets and Schemes. Darek's mind was a whirlwind as he made his way towards the heart of the new camp, where Laras and Lee were said to be meeting. He wasn't sure what he was planning to do or say, but he knew he needed to be there. The death of the scout was a spark, and he could sense the tension crackling in the air. He had to know what was happening, and more importantly, what was going to happen next. As he approached the main hall, a crude wooden structure built on the rocky shore of the lake, he saw a small crowd gathered outside. Mercenaries, free miners, even a few of the water mages, all murmuring anxiously amongst themselves. Darek pushed his way through, catching snippets of conversation as he went. They say Gomez sent his best men. Can't let this go unanswered. If we strike back, it'll be war. The voices blended together in a rising cacophony, but Darek pushed them aside, focusing on the large doors of the hall. He was almost there when a hand clamped down on his shoulder. "What do you think you're doing?" a gruff voice demanded. Darek turned to see Gorn glaring down at him, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She was one of the toughest mercenaries in the camp, and she had been keeping a close eye on him since his arrival. "I need to speak to Larry's," Darek said, shrugging off her grip. "If we're going to war, I want to know why." Gorn's expression softened slightly, though she didn't let go. "You're not the only one, but it's not your call to make. Laris and Lee are deciding what to do. They don't need you barging in there and making things worse." "I'm not trying to make things worse," Darek insisted. "But I've been to the old camp. I know what they're capable of. If we act without thinking, we could be walking into a trap." Gorn studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but you're not going in alone. If you've got something to say, you say it to me first." Darek hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, just get me in there." With Gorn leading the way, Darek was able to slip past the guards at the door and into the main hall. The inside was dimly lit, the flickering light of torches casting long shadows on the rough wooden walls. At the far end of the room, Laras and Lee were deep in conversation, their voices low but intense. Darek approached cautiously, his heart pounding. He had never spoken directly to Lee before, though he had seen him around the camp. Lee was a tall, imposing man with a sharp, angular face and piercing green eyes. He radiated authority and strength, and there was a quiet intensity about him that made it clear why he was the leader of the free miners. As Darek and Gorn drew closer, Laris looked up, his expression hardening. "What is it?" he asked. His tone clipped. Gorn stepped forward. "Darek has something to say. He thinks we need to be careful about how we respond." Lee's eyes shifted to Darek, his gaze cool and appraising. "And what makes you think you know what we should do?" Darek took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I've seen how Gomez operates. He's ruthless, but he's also smart. If he sent his men to kill one of our scouts, it's because he wants us to react. He's trying to draw us into a fight on his terms." Laris exchanged a look with Lee, then nodded slowly. "Go on." "If we strike back now, we're playing into his hands," Darek continued. "But if we do nothing, we look weak. We need to find another way, something that puts us in control, not him." Lee's expression didn't change, but Darek saw a flicker of interest in his eyes. "And what do you suggest?" Darek hesitated. He hadn't really thought that far ahead, but he knew he had to say something that would show he was more than just a fighter. "We need information," he said finally. "If we can find out what Gomez is planning, we can outmaneuver him. I've made contacts in the old camp. I can go back, find out what they know." Laris's eyebrows shot up. "You want to go back to the old camp? Are you crazy?" "It's risky, I know," Darek admitted. "But I can do it. I know the people there, and I know how to avoid trouble. If I can find out what Gomez is planning, we can make a move that he won't see coming." There was a long silence as Laras and Lee considered his words. Finally, Lee nodded. "It's dangerous, but it could work. If you're willing to take the risk, I'll back it." Laras still looked skeptical, but he nodded reluctantly. "All right, but you're not going alone. I'll send Diego with you. He knows the old camp, and he can watch your back." Darek felt a surge of relief. He had convinced them, at least for now. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Laris said grimly. "You're walking into the lion's den. Be careful." The journey back to the old camp was tense and nerve-wracking. Darek and Diego moved quickly and quietly, avoiding the main paths and keeping to the shadows. The closer they got, the more Derek's anxiety grew. He hadn't set foot in the old camp since he had left for the new camp, and he knew that his welcome would be far from warm. When they finally reached the outskirts of the camp, Diego stopped, his expression serious. "This is where we split up. I'll go in and make contact with one of my old friends, see what I can find out. You stay here and keep your head down." Darek nodded, though he felt a pang of apprehension at the thought of being left alone so close to enemy territory. "Be careful." Diego gave him a wry smile. "You too." As Diego disappeared into the darkness, Darek found himself a hiding spot behind a cluster of rocks, his heart pounding. He knew that what they were doing was dangerous, but it was the only way to get the information they needed. He waited, the minutes stretching out into what felt like hours. Every sound made him jump, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig setting his nerves on edge. He tried to focus, to keep his mind clear, but it wasn't easy. Finally, just as he was beginning to think that something had gone wrong, he heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. He tensed, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword, but then he saw Diego's familiar silhouette emerge from the shadows. "What did you find?" Darek whispered as Diego crouched down beside him. Chapter 7, Turning Point. Derek's heart pounded as he faced Thoris and the old camp guards. This was a nightmare scenario, trapped in the new camp with no idea how the enemy had gotten in and no clear way out. He and Diego were vastly outnumbered. As they stood frozen, the weight of the situation pressed down like the barrier itself. Thoris's smirk widened. "Didn't expect to see me here, did you? Gomez sends his regards." Derek's mind raced. The raiding party plan had been a ruse, meant to lure him and Diego out while Thoris and his men infiltrated the new camp. But how had they managed it? The new camp was known for its vigilance and its defenses. Diego took a step forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "How did you get in, Thoris? Did you really think you'd just waltz out of here after pulling a stunt like this?" Thoris chuckled darkly, crossing his arms. "We have our ways. And as for getting out, well, that depends on how cooperative you lot decide to be." Darek glanced around. There were more guards emerging from the shadows, at least a dozen of them, all armed and looking dangerous. The new camp's mercenaries were nowhere to be seen. He had to stall, buy time to figure out what was really going on. "What do you want, Thoris?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Why are you here?" Thoris's gaze shifted to Darek, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is about you, kid? You're nothing more than a nuisance. No, this is about something bigger. Gomez is tired of playing games. He wants control of the new camp's ore, and he's willing to spill as much blood as it takes to get it." Darek swallowed hard. He knew what that meant. Gomez wasn't just sending a message, he was making a play for power, one that could destabilize the entire colony. "What's your plan, then?" Diego asked, his voice steady. "Storm the camp, kill everyone who resists, and take what you want." Thoris laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Something like that. But first, we have a little business to take care of." He gestured, and two of his men stepped forward, dragging someone between them. Derek's stomach lurched as he recognized Larry's, his hands bound and his face bruised. The mercenary leader looked battered but defiant, his eyes blazing with fury. "You bastards!" Diego snarled, his hand going to his sword. "If you hurt him, I swear." "Easy now," Thoris said, raising a hand. "He's alive for now. Whether he stays that way depends on how smart you are." Darek felt a cold knot of fear in his gut. This was worse than he'd thought. With Laris captured, the new camp's leadership was crippled. And if Thoris had Laris, what had happened to Lee? "What do you want us to do?" Darek asked, keeping his voice calm. Thoris's smile widened. "It's simple, really. You're going to take us to Lee. Once we have him, we'll be in control. The new camp will be ours, and you lot can decide whether you want to live or die." Darek glanced at Diego, who gave the slightest shake of his head. They couldn't lead Thoris to Lee, not if they wanted to keep any hope of resistance alive. "Lee's not here," Darek said, hoping he sounded convincing. "He's out on a scouting mission with some of the other mercenaries. You're not going to find him." Thoris's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. "Is that so? And where exactly is this scouting mission?" Darek forced himself to shrug. I don't know. They don't tell us grunts that kind of thing. For a moment, Thoris seemed to waver, then he scowled. You're lying, but that's fine. We'll find him ourselves. He turned to his men. Search the camp. Find Lee and any other leaders. If anyone resists, kill. Here's the text rewritten without any changes. Them. The guards nodded and fanned out, moving with grim efficiency. Derek's mind raced. He needed to do something, anything, to stop this. If they found Lee, if they took control of the new camp, it would be a slaughter. Diego's voice broke through his thoughts, low and urgent. We need to get to the water mages. If anyone can turn this around, it's them. Darek nodded. The water mages were powerful, and they had been preparing for something big. If they could reach Sachuras and the others, they might have a chance to turn the tide. Lead the way, he whispered back. They began to move, slipping through the shadows as Thoris's men spread out through the camp. It was slow going. Every corner, every alley was a potential ambush. But Diego's knowledge of the camp's layout was invaluable, guiding them through back paths and hidden routes. As they neared the mage's tower, a flicker of hope sparked in Derek's chest. They could do this. They could. Hold it right there. Darek and Diego froze as a group of old camp guards stepped out from behind a stack of crates, weapons drawn. There were 5 of them, all looking ready for a fight. Diego's hand tightened on his sword, his eyes darting between the guards. We don't want any trouble. Just let us through. One of the guards, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, sneered. Too bad. We've got orders to keep anyone from getting to the mages, and that includes you. Derek's heart sank. Of course, Thoris would have thought of this. He couldn't risk the water mages interfering. Then you're going to have to go through us, Diego said, his voice hard. Darek drew his sword, his grip steady despite the fear gnawing at him. He wasn't sure how they were going to get out of this, but he wasn't about to back down. The guards moved in, and the fight erupted in a blur of steel and shouts. Darek blocked the first blow aimed at him, feeling the impact reverberate through his arm. He countered with a quick slash, forcing his opponent back. Beside him, Diego fought with a fierce, controlled fury, his movements precise and deadly. He parried a blow from one guard, then spun and drove his blade into another's side. Blood spurted and the man crumpled with a gasp. Darek ducked under a wild swing and lashed out with his sword, catching his opponent's leg. The guard stumbled and Darek pressed the advantage, driving his sword into the man's chest. The fight was short but brutal. In moments, 3 of the guards were down, and the remaining 2 were backing away, their faces pale with fear. Go! Diego shouted, his sword dripping with blood. Get to the mages. Darek hesitated, then nodded. He turned and ran, his heart pounding as he sprinted towards the tower. He could hear the sounds of battle behind him, Diego's shouts and the clash of steel, but he forced himself to keep going. As he reached the tower, the door swung open, and Saturas stepped out, his face grim. Darek, what's happening? The old camp, Darek panted, trying to catch his breath. They've taken Laris. They're looking for Lee. We need to do something, or they'll take the whole camp. Saturas's eyes narrowed. Where's Diego? Fighting, Darek said, his voice strained. He's trying to hold them off, but there's too many. Saturas nodded, his expression hardening. Come inside. We've been preparing for this. Darek followed him into the tower, his heart racing. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of incense and strange herbs. The other water mages were gathered around a large stone table, their faces tense and determined. We've been expecting an attack. Saturas said as they approached the table. Gomez has been getting bolder, and we knew it was only a matter of time before he tried something like this. What can we do? Darek asked, his voice desperate. They're tearing the camp apart. Saturas's eyes gleamed. We've been working on a spell, something that could turn the tide. It's dangerous, and it will take time, but if we can pull it off, we can drive them out of the camp. Derek's heart lifted. What do you need me to do? Saturas's gaze was steady. Hold the line. Keep them away from the tower until we're ready. If they break through, it's over. Darek nodded, his resolve hardening. I'll do whatever it takes. Saturas placed a hand on his shoulder. I know you will. And Darek, thank you for everything. Darek swallowed, then turned and headed for the door. As he stepped outside, the sounds of battle crashed over him like a wave. He gripped his sword tightly, his jaw set. This was it. The turning point. One way or another, the fate of the new camp would be decided here in the shadow of the barrier. Chapter 8. The Final Stand. Darek stepped out of the tower, his sword gleaming in the dim light of the camp's torches. The sounds of battle echoed from the far side of the camp, where Diego was still fighting to hold off Thoris's men. He couldn't see the battle from where he was, but he knew it was only a matter of time before more enemies converged on the tower. He glanced back at the mage's tower, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. Satyras and the water mages were their last hope, but if the old camp's forces broke through before the spell was ready, everything would be lost. Darek took a deep breath and started towards the front line, where a few of the remaining new camp mercenaries were gathering to make a stand. They were a ragged, exhausted bunch, men and women who had been caught off guard and were now desperately trying to regroup. But their faces were grim, and there was a fierce determination in their eyes. "Darek!" a voice called out. He turned to see Jarvis, one of the more experienced mercenaries, limping towards him. His arm was wrapped in a crude bandage, blood seeping through the cloth. "What's the situation?" "Satyras and the water mages are preparing a spell," Darek said, his voice urgent. "But they need time. We have to hold the line here. Keep Thoris's men from reaching the tower." Jarvis nodded, his expression hard. "We'll hold them. We have to." Darek glanced around at the few mercenaries still standing. There weren't many, maybe 20 at most, but they were all that stood between the old camp's forces and the mages. He turned back to Jarvis. "We need to set up a defensive position. Get everyone in place. We'll make our stand here." Jarvis nodded and started barking orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. The mercenaries moved quickly, dragging crates and barrels into place, forming a makeshift barricade in front of the tower. They took up positions behind the barricade, weapons at the ready, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Darek took his place near the center of the line, his heart pounding. He could feel the tension in the air, a palpable sense of dread. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and exhausted, but they were ready to fight. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The sounds of battle grew louder, closer. Darek tightened his grip on his sword, his eyes fixed on the shadows ahead. He could see flickers of movement, the faint glint of metal in the darkness. And then they came. Thoris's men surged out of the shadows, a wave of armored figures charging towards the barricade. Darek raised his sword, his voice rising in a shout. "Hold the line." The clash was immediate and brutal. Swords clanged against shields, the air filled with the shouts of the mercenaries and the roars of the attackers. Darek met the first attacker head-on, his sword crashing against the man's shield. He shoved forward, his muscles straining, and drove his blade into the man's side. The guard fell with a gasp, and Darek whirled to face the next. Beside him, Jarvis was fighting fiercely, his sword a blur as he cut down another attacker. But there were too many. More and more guards poured in, their numbers overwhelming. Darek fought desperately, his sword rising and falling, each swing a struggle. He blocked a blow from a heavy-set guard, then twisted and slashed at another's leg. Blood splattered, and the guard went down with a scream. But for every enemy they cut down, 2 more seemed to take their place. Derek's arms were aching, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the lines starting to buckle, the weight of the assault pressing them back. A guard lunged at him, and Darek barely had time to parry, the force of the blow driving him to one knee. He struggled to rise, but the guard was already on him, sword raised for a killing blow. And then the guard jerked, his eyes widening in shock, before collapsing to the ground, a crossbow bolt protruding from his throat. Darek looked up in surprise to see a group of free miners rushing to their aid, crossbows in hand. They fired into the mass of attackers, their bolts finding their marks with deadly precision. The guards hesitated, their charge faltering under the sudden counterattack. Jarvis grinned, blood streaking his face. "About time you showed up." The leader of the free miners, a tall, lean man named Gorn, nodded grimly. "Better late than never." Darek pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling. "We have to hold them here. Satyras is almost ready." Gorn's eyes narrowed. "Then we'd better make sure he gets the time he needs." He raised his hand, and the free miners surged forward, their crossbows firing in rapid succession. The old camp guards fell back, momentarily stunned by the ferocity of the assault. But Thoris wasn't done yet. He stepped forward, his eyes blazing with fury. "Press the attack," he roared. "Crush them." The guards rallied, surging forward with renewed fury. The battle raged on, the air thick with the sounds of clashing steel and the cries of the wounded. Darek fought on, his body moving on instinct. He was exhausted, every muscle screaming in protest, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. A guard swung at him, and he ducked, his sword lashing out to catch the man in the side. The guard stumbled, and Darek pressed the advantage, driving his blade home. He turned, searching for the next opponent, but what he saw made his blood run cold. Thoris was pushing through the fray, cutting down anyone who got in his way. His eyes were fixed on the tower, a grim determination etched on his face. "Jarvis!" Darek shouted, his voice raw. "He's going for the mages." Jarvis's head snapped around, his eyes widening. "We have to stop him!" But they were too far away, the battle between them and Thoris, a chaotic, seething mass of bodies. Darek started to move, but a guard lunged at him, forcing him to parry. "No!" he shouted, frustration and fear boiling inside him. He struck down the guard, but there were more. Always more. Thoris was almost at the tower now, his sword cutting through the last few defenders. Darek's heart pounded. If Thoris reached the mages, if he interrupted the spell, a flash of light erupted from the tower, blindingly bright. Thoris staggered, his sword dropping as he raised his arm to shield his eyes. The air crackled with energy, a low, resonant hum filling the camp. Darek felt it, a deep vibration that seemed to resonate through his bones. He glanced at the tower, his eyes widening as he saw Saturus and the water mages standing on the steps, their hands raised, a swirling vortex of energy forming around them. "It's happening," Jarvis shouted, his voice barely audible over the rising hum. "They're casting the spell." The vortex grew, the light intensifying until it was almost unbearable. The guards hesitated, their faces pale with fear, and some began to back away. Thoris's eyes blazed with fury. "No," he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Kill them! Kill them all!" He charged forward, but the energy from the vortex flared, a wave of force rippling outwards. Thoris was thrown back, his body slamming into the ground with a bone-jarring impact. The vortex reached its peak, a blinding column of light shooting up into the sky. Darek felt the force of it wash over him, a sensation like standing in the heart of a storm. He staggered, struggling to stay on his feet as the light pulsed and throbbed, and then, with a sound like thunder, the light exploded outwards. The wave of energy swept across the camp, a blinding, searing force that knocked everyone to the ground. Darek felt himself lifted, thrown through the air before crashing down hard. For a moment, everything was still. The camp was silent, the air thick with the scent of ozone and the lingering hum of magic. Darek struggled to his feet, his body aching, his vision blurred. He looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened. The old camp guards were scattered, many of them unconscious, others struggling to rise. Thoris lay motionless near the base of the tower, his body crumpled and still. Darek turned towards the tower, his heart pounding. Satyras and the other mages were still standing, their faces pale, but Chapter 9, Revelations. The camp was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the battle, the only sounds the crackling of dying fires and the groans of the wounded. Darek stood amidst the chaos, his eyes scanning the devastation that had once been their home. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, both friends and foes, and the air was thick with the scent of blood and smoke. The cost of their victory weighed heavily on his shoulders, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. He turned towards the mages' tower, where Saturus and the water mages were gathered, their expressions grim. The spell they had cast had saved the camp, but it had drained them. Darek could see the exhaustion etched into their faces, the way they leaned on each other for support. Even Saturus, who always seemed so composed and in control, looked haggard, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. Darek made his way towards them, stepping carefully over the debris and bodies. As he approached, Saturus looked up, his gaze meeting Darek's. There was something in the mage's eyes, a mixture of relief and sorrow that made Darek's stomach clench. "It's done," Darek said quietly. "Thoris is dead. The old camp has been driven back." Saturus nodded slowly, his gaze drifting over the battlefield. "Yes, but at what cost?" Darek didn't have an answer. He glanced around, his heart aching as he saw the faces of the fallen mercenaries. These were men and women he had fought alongside, people who had trusted him to lead them. And now, so many of them were gone. "I wish there had been another way," Saturus murmured, his voice barely audible. "But Thoris gave us no choice." Darek clenched his fists, anger flaring inside him. It shouldn't have come to this. We should have found a way to negotiate to avoid all this bloodshed. Saturus sighed, his shoulders slumping. Perhaps, but Thoris was not a man to be reasoned with. His ambition blinded him, drove him to madness. He would have destroyed everything we've built here, just to satisfy his own thirst for power. Darek looked away, his jaw tight. He knew Saturus was right, but it didn't make the loss any easier to bear. "We need to regroup," he said after a moment, forcing himself to focus on the present. "There are still wounded who need help, and the camp is vulnerable. If Gomez decides to launch another attack..." Saturus shook his head. "No, Gomez will not strike again so soon, not after this." He gestured towards the battlefield, the devastation plain to see. "He knows now what we are capable of. He will hesitate, bide his time." Darek frowned. "But he won't give up, not completely." "No," Saturus agreed, "he will not. But we have bought ourselves some time at least." Darek nodded, though the thought did little to ease his mind. Time was something they desperately needed, but it was also something they were running out of. The barrier still loomed overhead, a constant reminder of their imprisonment. And now, with the old camp's forces broken but not defeated, their situation was more precarious than ever. "Darek," a voice called out, cutting through his thoughts. He turned to see Diego approaching, a bandage wrapped around his arm and a weary but relieved smile on his face. "You made it," Darek said, feeling a surge of relief. Diego had been fighting on the front lines, and Darek had feared the worst. Diego clapped him on the shoulder. "I could say the same to you. I heard about what you did, taking down Thoris like that. Hell of a thing." Darek shook his head. "It wasn't just me. We all fought, and we lost too many." Diego's smile faded, and he nodded solemnly. "Yeah, we did, but we're still standing. And as long as we're standing, we have a chance." Darek glanced at Saturus, who was deep in conversation with the other mages. "What about the spell? Did it work?" Diego shrugged. "Depends on what you mean by work. It pushed back the old camp, sure, but we're still under the barrier. Saturus says it was a partial success. They were able to strengthen the magic around the new camp, make it harder for Gomez to attack directly. But it's not enough to get us out." Derek's heart sank. He had hoped, somehow, that the spell would be the key to their freedom. But of course, it was never that simple. "So what now?" he asked, his voice heavy. Diego looked thoughtful. "We regroup, like you said, lick our wounds, rebuild. But more than that, we need to figure out our next move. Gomez isn't going to just sit back and wait forever. We need a plan." Darek nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that. There's something else going on here. Something we're missing." Diego raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Darek hesitated, unsure how to put his thoughts into words. Thoris was obsessed with the sleeper. He kept talking about it, saying it was the key to everything, and there's been talk among the diggers, rumors about strange things happening in the old mine. Diego frowned. Strange things? Disappearances? Strange lights? Voices in the dark? I didn't think much of it at first, but now, I'm not so sure. Diego's expression grew serious. "You think it's connected? To the sleeper?" Darek nodded. "I don't know, but I think it's worth looking into. If there's something down there, something Gomez is trying to keep hidden, it could be the advantage we need." Diego was silent for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. Then he nodded. "All right, it's a long shot, but it's the best idea we've got. We'll need to be careful, though. Gomez will have the old mine locked down tight." Darek felt a spark of hope, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in days. "We'll find a way in. We have to." Diego clapped him on the shoulder again. "That's the spirit. I'll start gathering some of the boys, see who's up for a little expedition." Darek nodded, feeling a surge of determination. It was a long shot, but it was something. And after everything they had been through, he was willing to take any chance they had. As Diego turned to leave, Darek looked back at the tower, where Saturus was watching them, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Darek?" the mage called out, his voice calm but firm. "There's something else you should know." Darek approached, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Satyrus glanced around, then lowered his voice. The spell we cast, it wasn't just to protect the camp. We were also trying to reach something, a source of power deep within the barrier. We felt it, for a moment, a connection. Derek's eyes widened. A source of power? What do you mean? Satyrus hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. The barrier is not just a prison, Darek. It's a construct, a creation of immense magical energy. If we can find the source, if we can harness it. Derek's heart skipped a beat. We could break the barrier. Satyrus nodded slowly. Yes, but it is dangerous, incredibly dangerous. We don't know what lies at the heart of the barrier, or what kind of power we would be dealing with. But it may be our only hope. Darek felt a thrill of fear and excitement. It was a risk, a gamble unlike any they had taken before. But it was also a chance to finally end this nightmare. I'll do it, he said, his voice steady, whatever it takes. Satyrus looked at him, a faint smile touching his lips. I thought you might say that. Darek glanced back at the camp, at the faces of the men and women who had fought and bled for this place. They deserved more than this, more than to be trapped like animals in a cage. He turned back to Satyrus, his resolve hardening. Tell me what I need to do. Satyrus's eyes gleamed with determination. First, we need to find the source, and for that, we'll need to go deeper into the old mine, much deeper than anyone has ever gone before. Darek nodded, his heart pounding. Then we'd better get started. The mage nodded, his gaze intense. Indeed, the fate of the colony may well depend on it. And as Darek turned to prepare for the journey ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The shadows of the barrier were dark and deep, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a light waiting to be found at the heart of the darkness. Chapter 10. Breaking the Chains. Darek stood at the mouth of the old mine, staring into the dark abyss that stretched before him. The tunnel entrance was guarded by a makeshift barricade, its surface scarred from countless battles. Mercenaries and diggers moved about nervously, their eyes darting towards the entrance as if expecting something monstrous to emerge at any moment. Diego and a handful of trusted fighters gathered around Darek. They were armed and armored, their faces set with grim determination. Despite the victory over Thoris, tension lingered in the air. Everyone knew that this expedition into the old mine was unlike any they had attempted before. The stakes were higher, and the risks even greater. You're sure about this, Darek? Diego asked, his voice low. Going down there, it's madness. Darek nodded, his gaze fixed on the shadows beyond the barricade. It's the only way. If Satyrus is right, and there's a source of power deep within the barrier, it could be the key to everything. It could set us free. Diego shook his head, a skeptical smile tugging at his lips. And if he's wrong? Darek glanced at his friend, his expression serious. Then we die trying, but I'd rather die fighting for a chance at freedom than live another day as a prisoner. Diego's smile faded, and he nodded slowly. I get it. Just be careful down there. If we lose you, the camp... You won't lose me, Darek interrupted, his voice firm. We're in this together, remember? Diego's grin returned, though it was tinged with worry. Yeah, I remember. They turned to the rest of the group. Gorn, his massive frame clad in heavy armor, gripped his axe tightly. Laris stood beside him, his bow slung over his shoulder, his eyes sharp and alert. Lester, the novice from the swamp camp, fidgeted nervously with his staff, muttering prayers under his breath. All right, Darek said, raising his voice to address them. We're going in deeper than anyone's gone before. We don't know what we'll find, but we do know it's going to be dangerous. Stay close, watch each other's backs, and whatever happens, don't get separated. There were nods and murmurs of agreement. Darek took a deep breath, then turned and began walking towards the mine entrance. The others followed, their footsteps echoing in the narrow tunnel. The air grew colder as they descended, the light from their torches flickering against the rough stone walls. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the darkness became, pressing in around them like a physical force. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and acrid that made Darek's skin crawl. They passed through abandoned shafts and collapsed tunnels, their footsteps kicking up clouds of dust. Occasionally, they would hear the distant clatter of rocks falling or the faint, eerie sound of wind whistling through the cavern. But otherwise, the mine was deathly silent. As they ventured deeper, they began to notice signs of recent activity, freshly dug tunnels, piles of ore that hadn't been there before. Lares ran his fingers over the walls, frowning. "This is recent," he muttered. "Gomez must have been working down here, digging for something." Darek nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. Whatever it is, he's desperate to keep it hidden. They continued on, their nerves stretched thin. Hours seemed to pass, though it was impossible to tell time in the pitch-black depths. Finally, they reached a wide chamber, its ceiling disappearing into the shadows above. In the center of the room stood a massive stone door, its surface covered in intricate carvings and symbols that glowed faintly in the torchlight. Gorn whistled softly. "Well, that's something you don't see every day." Darek stepped closer, his eyes tracing the patterns on the door. The symbols were ancient, their meaning lost to time, but he could feel the power emanating from them, a faint hum that seemed to resonate in his bones. "Satyrus said there would be a seal," Darek murmured, running his fingers over the carvings. "A magical barrier protecting the source. This must be it." Lester nodded, his eyes wide with awe. "The power here, it's incredible. I can feel it like a pulse." Diego glanced around, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "So how do we get past it?" Darek pulled out a small, intricately carved crystal from his pouch, the one Saturas had given him before they left. "With this, it's a key of sorts. Satyrus said it should unlock the seal, but we'll need to be ready, whatever's on the other side." He trailed off, his gaze meeting each of theirs in turn. They nodded, tightening their grips on their weapons. Darek took a deep breath, then pressed the crystal against the center of the door. There was a sudden flash of light, blinding in its intensity. The door shuddered, the carvings glowing brighter and brighter until they were almost too painful to look at. The air crackled with energy, and a low, resonant hum filled the chamber, growing louder and louder until it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. And then, with a deafening roar, the door swung open. The light faded, revealing a vast, shadowy chamber beyond. At the far end, a massive, crystalline structure pulsed with a dark, malevolent energy, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. "The source," Lester whispered, his voice trembling. "That's it." Darek stepped forward, his heart pounding. The power radiating from the crystal was overwhelming, a force unlike anything he had ever felt. It called to him, a dark whisper in the back of his mind promising freedom, power, everything he had ever dreamed of. But there was something else too. A darkness coiled around it, a sense of something vast and terrible lurking just beyond the veil. "We need to destroy it," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever this is, it's not just holding the barrier. It's corrupting it, feeding on it." Diego nodded, his face pale but resolute. "And how do we do that?" Darek hesitated, then glanced at Lester. "The novices in the swamp camp, they use focus stones to channel energy, right? If we can disrupt the flow, destabilize it..." Lester's eyes widened. "You want to use a focus stone to blow it up?" Darek nodded. "It's the only way." Gorn grinned, hefting his axe. "Well, if it's going to be a big bang, I'm all in." Lester swallowed hard, but he nodded. "All right, but we'll need to get close, and the energy there. It's going to be dangerous." "We've come this far," Darek said quietly. "We're not turning back now." They moved cautiously towards the crystal, the air growing thick and heavy as they approached. Darek could feel the energy swirling around them, a maelstrom of power and darkness. His skin tingled, and his head throbbed, but he forced himself to keep moving. They reached the base of the crystal, and Darek pulled out the focus stone, his hands shaking. He placed it carefully on the ground, then began to channel his energy into it, focusing everything he had on disrupting the flow of power. The crystal began to pulse faster, the light within it flickering erratically. The air vibrated with tension, and Darek could feel the darkness within it, writhing and twisting, fighting against him. "Come on," he muttered, gritting his teeth. "Come on." There was a sudden, blinding flash, and the crystal shattered, a deafening roar filling the chamber. Darek was thrown backwards, his vision swimming, and he felt a surge of energy wash over him, burning and freezing all at once. When he opened his eyes, the crystal was gone, its remnants scattered across the floor. The darkness that had surrounded it was fading, dissipating like mist in the sunlight. And then he felt it, the barrier, weakening, its oppressive presence lifting. "We did it," Diego breathed, his voice filled with wonder. Darek, we did it. Darek struggled to his feet, his body aching, but he couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. They had done it. The barrier was breaking. But even as relief washed over him, a shadow fell across the chamber. He looked up, his heart clenching, as he saw a figure standing in the entrance. Gomez. The former leader of the old camp stepped forward, his eyes blazing with fury and desperation. You think you've won? He snarled, his voice echoing in the chamber. You think this changes anything? He drew his sword, the blade gleaming in the dim light. I won't let you take this from me. I won't let you destroy everything I've built. Darek stepped forward, his own sword in hand, his gaze steady. It's over, Gomez. The barrier is breaking. It's time to end this. Gomez's face twisted with rage. I'll kill you first. He lunged forward, his sword slicing through the air. Darek met him head-on, their blades clashing with a deafening ring. The fight was brutal, a blur of steel and fury. Gomez was strong, stronger than Darek had expected, his attacks fueled by desperation and rage. But Darek fought with a different kind of strength, a strength born of hope, of determination, of the knowledge that freedom was within reach. With a final, desperate swing, Darek knocked Gomez's sword from his hand. The man staggered back, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. No, Gomez whispered, his voice broken. This can't be. Darek stepped forward, his sword at the ready, but there was no need. Gomez fell to his knees, his head bowed, the fight gone from him. It's over, Darek said softly, his voice echoing in the silent chamber. It's over. He turned, his gaze sweeping over his friends, his heart swelling with pride and relief. They had done it. They had broken the chains that bound them, shattered the barrier that had held them prisoner for so long. And now, as the last remnants of the crystal's power faded into the darkness, the colony was free. Epilogue. The sky was a brilliant shade of blue, the sun shining brightly overhead. For the first time in what felt like forever, Darek stood outside the shadow of the barrier, the cool breeze ruffling his hair, the scent of pine and wildflowers filling his lungs. The colony was a different place now. The camps, once divided and at war, were working together, rebuilding what had been destroyed. The old camp's fortress had been abandoned, its walls crumbling, its halls empty. The new camp and the swamp camp had merged, forming a new, united community in the heart of the Valley of Mines. Darek watched as men and women moved about the camp, their faces no longer marked by fear or anger, but by hope. There was still much to do, many wounds to heal, but for the first time, they were free to shape their own destiny. Diego appeared beside him, a wide grin on his face. You did it, Darek. We did it. Darek nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. We did. Diego clapped him on the shoulder. So, what now? Darek looked out over the valley, his heart swelling with a sense of endless possibility. Now? Now we start over. Build something new, something better. He glanced at Diego, his smile widening. And who knows, maybe we'll find a way to fix the world outside, too. Diego laughed, the sound bright and carefree. One step at a time, my friend. One step at a time. They stood there for a long time, watching as the sun set over the mountains, casting the valley in a golden light. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it was theirs to shape. And whatever lay ahead, Darek knew they would face it together. As free men in a world without chains. Subscribe to Sakura Audiobooks. Give us a thumbs up and leave a comment if you enjoy our work. Your support means a lot to us.